church is not a political party, and it's not a social service agency. The church isn't a country club or some other gathering of friends who get together for mutual support and social activities. I feel the need to say that because all of those functions and identities have been taken on as the primary purpose for many churches and even some whole denominations. Rather than those, the church is first and foremost an expression of a continuing tradition that makes possible a human experience of the spiritual dimension of reality. And the confusion about the function, identity, and purpose of church has come about because Western culture, the culture we live in, increasingly world culture, recognizes only the reality of the material world and has fallen completely out of touch with the spiritual dimension. Those who participate in one or another institutional expressions of church have had to rely then on these other functions and identities and purposes as justification for their actions. Because very few people these days look any deeper than that. And when I say that the church is not a political party, I mean more than simply to be advocating the separation of church and state. In fact, I think that the concept of separation of church and state is based on the misidentification of the church as a political party or something like it. A kind of equivalent to the state that just needs to stay in its own lane. And by political party, I don't mean merely some view that the church is Republican or Democratic, conservative or liberal. This problem arises whenever the church is seen as representing any kind of ideology, even when that ideology tries to pass under the heading of some system of beliefs. Faith is not a system of beliefs. It's an active, living relationship with God. The church isn't part of any culture wars. It can, in fact, find adequate and excellent expression within any culture, using the symbols of any culture. And it has, from ancient Rome to the Middle Ages, from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment to Africa and Asia and Mesoamerica and whatever subcultures make up those places. Those who feel that there's a religious threat in a changing culture, in changing and evolving laws, in alternate and optional lifestyles, are confusing Christianity with Christianism and only reinforcing their blindness to the spiritual dimension of reality. Slightly different form of blindness is the identification of the church as a social service agency. In our current society, maybe the last 30, 40 years, those who see the church as expressing a political identity, a particular political identity and purpose, tend to be on the political right. It's the Christian right, as the media terms it. The identification of the church with social service, primarily, seems to come from the political left. not experiencing, I guess, the reality of the spiritual dimension in life. People who are part of the church, who have a strong empathic conscience, have sought justification for continued religious activity in what the church can do to help people. And that alternative purpose is not only used to justify the church to non-Christian outsiders who can't really understand what spirit is all about, but also to those who feel a real spiritual calling that in our current materialistic context seems only to be satisfied by charitable actions in the material world. Church congregations are judged harshly, not only by outsiders, but also by denominational leadership, even their own membership, if they don't do enough outreach, if they don't extend out and care enough for the community and its needs. A number of years ago, a representative of our diocese met with the vestry here at St. James. And the vestry shared what it saw are some of our problems, and also shared the beginnings of a vision for future development. But the diocesan representative concluded that the vestry just didn't understand what ministry was all about. That person mistakenly applied an inapplicable stereotype to our situation. They made the assumption that St. James was just like any other congregation they saw caught up in some inward focused view of the church as a country club. Or if country club wasn't fully appropriate, saw itself as a group of people who came together to just meet their own needs for community, to have parties, to take on projects, to have special events. And while that showed a deep misunderstanding of what the vestry was really trying to get at and had asked for help to get at, it's a judgment that can be fairly applied to many church communities and probably partially applied to nearly all, St. James included at times. Or not the Pebble Beach Golf Club, certainly. But neither are we Rotary or Kiwanis or any kind of social or service club. We're not an extended family or a substitute for one. At least not primarily. We're not only a fellowship whose purpose is fellowshipping, or just a place to hide from the loneliness of the world, though God knows that's needed. Now, all that being said, I do believe very strongly that the church, our faith, our sense of spiritual grounding is relevant and motivating and probably essential for true political action, for our care for those who are victims of our cultural and economic systems, essential for the meeting of basic human needs, for relationship and fellowship. And those functions and identities can, in fact, be appropriate expressions of church. But faith has to come first, asserting the primacy of spirit in life, primacy of spirit for life, or anything that is real life. we can see very clearly, I think, in this year of 2020, what happens without that grounding. What happens when we put up with an amoral politics, when we try to use a greed-based social ethic to make things work out and to have as many markets available as we can. We see it in the sustaining of forced isolation and what that can mean for our lives, month after month, maybe year after year. It's precisely the lack of grounding in the spiritual dimension of reality, the lack of a foundation in spirit, a lack of even truly believing there is a spiritual reality, a spiritual dimension to things, as real and essential as any material object, maybe more so. The lack of that has been what has brought on this horrendous year. I believe that the material world that we experience is itself a projection into time of the eternal pulsing of creation within the spiritual dimension. Spirit and the soul of the world that it creates when incarnate comes first. Must be our ultimate concern, as some have defined religion. Politics, social service, and fellowship all must be based in that spirit, grounded in that spirit, or else they just become pointless flailings of a species-wide narcissism that ends only in a hollow life, in an idolatrous church, and such a lack of care for those that come after us that we're willing to destroy the whole planetary environment so that we won't be inconvenienced or have to deny ourselves stuff. The material world and all our interactions with it must be experienced sacramentally as outward and visible signs of some omnipresent spiritual grace. To fail at that leaves only an oppressive law and a crazy-making disorder where you don't know what's coming next, when what we most desperately need is the law of love and the true order of God. Our lives in this material dimension, bounded by space and time, will surely end from COVID-19 or something else, sooner or later. In the material dimension, we are but dust, and to dust we will return. But our lives in the spirit, the dimension of soul that has always been there and will always be, is where we find eternal life. And that's what the church is all about. Thanks be to God.